You don't know what you're capable of and what inner strength and inner resolve you've got until you've been challenged, and don't fear challenge.
What is up, everybody? And hello from planet Earth. I'm your host, Philip. Most of you'll know me as Phil, and this is the Future Minds podcast. Simply the best podcast out there, covering all you need to know in edtech, online learning, the digital economy, and what's being done around the world to shape the minds of the future. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Lorna Cobbett. Currently the Managing Director at Hawthorne Advisors, Lorna became a strategic communications advisor after a successful career in investment banking. At Goldman Sachs, she was an executive director focused on industrials and natural resource companies, having previously worked for Citi and Deutsche Bank. Most recently, Lorna was a partner at Bell Pottinger for over 6 years with their financial and corporate division. Lorna has over 15 years of extensive experience in providing corporate advice and working on transactions for private and public companies. Lorna is actively involved in fundraising and raising awareness for Chestnut Tree House, a children's hospice in West Sussex, and Together for Short Lives. In this episode, we cover topics such as the powerful and inspiring story of Essie, how to raise kind, aware, empathetic, and curious children, why life is for living and kindness is everything, how to maintain perspective in your everyday life, and a range of other topics. I really enjoyed this inspiring and thought-provoking conversation with Lorna, and I'm sure you will too. Without further ado, I give you Lorna Cobbett. Lorna.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome.
How is everything in the UK?
Cold.
Interesting times.
Yeah. Christmassy, earlier than ever before, I think, is probably a fair assessment of where we are at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I mean, just the context of the lockdown and the pandemic being dragged on for so long, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's been a year to remember and a year to forget, I think, for sure, for many people.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so as we get started, I'd love it if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Sure.
And then we can get into the education conversation.
So I'm Lorna Cobbett. I have 3 hats, I suppose. I have my work hat, which is I work for a communications consultancy in London. I have my social media Instagram hat, which is Mummy Loves Essie, where I tell the story of me and my children on there. And I have my 3rd hat, which I guess is mummy to Roman, Eva, and to Essie, who are triplets. And Essie was my daughter, who was born severely disabled and unfortunately died aged 18 months. So I am living a life where I'm trying to adjust to being a parent and a mother to 3 children, but the world only sees 2.
That's an incredible story. I suppose, as you feel comfortable, if we could maybe get into what led you to, start blogging about motherhood. Was this something that you'd always wanted to do? Or is it something that just recently started?
I always say that my brain is slightly wired differently to most people. I love words and I love numbers, and I've always been interested in words and writing. And when I quit investment banking, because I used to be an investment banker before I moved into the communications profession, I went travelling around Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, and I ended up writing then. And I quite like the style of blogging and the engagement and the interaction that you can get with people. And when we realised that shortly after the triplets were born, that Essie needed very significant support from a healthcare perspective going forward, and the NHS unfortunately weren't willing at the time to provide us with the support, I took the decision to tell our story publicly, because I wanted to, quite frankly, shame the NHS into providing us with the support that we would need to be able to give Essie and indeed Roman and Eva as well, and if not us, the quality of life that we felt that we should be experiencing during what was inevitably going to be a shorter life for her. So that's where Mummy Loves Essie got created, and it got created to tell our story publicly, to share an experience that is often a lonely one for many people, and sometimes there is an element of shame when you're trying to tell the world that maybe your child, for whatever reason, is less than perfect or not quite fitting in the normal category. So that's where the writing and the inspiration came from. And quite frankly, it's got a very strong selfish angle to it in many ways, because I wanted to have those memories and everything documented about life with Essie for however long or short it was going to be.
Wow. I mean, I think life-changing is a complete understatement for what something like that does to a person. But as you mentioned now, there's probably, there are people out there that go through this, these sort of life tragedies in a very lonely manner. What are some of the things that, you've experienced or learned in this process that you feel the world would be a better place for knowing?
Yeah. That life is for living, fundamentally. As evidenced in 2020, I'm sure it's something that a lot of people can empathise with, and that normal is underrated, like little things, like to be able to walk out the house and to just go for a walk, whereas because Essie was on oxygen because her lungs were so poor 24/7, and she also couldn't feed orally, so she was fed via a feeding tube, just being able to walk out of the house and to not have a second thought about taking rescue medication in case your daughter had a seizure or little things like that. I think people sometimes want to aspire to be something that they feel is what their life objective should be, and for many people that's unobtainable. But actually, if you just take a step back and you realise what your life actually contains and how privileged in some ways you are because of everything that you can do from a normal perspective, like that is so important. And I think the other thing that I try to instill in the kids, we call them the kids just as an anecdote, because I hate the word triplets, because it will always prompt discussion around sort of why two, where's the third one? So whenever I talk about Roman and Eva, I refer to them as the kids. But anyway, I digress. But the point is that when we're bringing up the kids, we're wanting them to be as kind and as inclusive as possible. And for me, that's the definition of parenting success. If I raise children that see the world through open eyes, non-prejudice eyes, inclusive eyes, and have kindness at their core, then that's all I can ask for.
No, that's an incredible message. To maybe just take a step back within the degree of comfort that you feel comfortable sharing, can you maybe tell us a little bit about Essie's story?
The triplets was our first journey into parenthood, slightly unexpected. I think I managed to both laugh and cry when I got told that we were pregnant with triplets. And it was a boy and two girls, with the girls being identical. So they are, for those people that are maybe more familiar with medical terminology, they were mono twins, which basically meant that they were same sac, same placenta, which always carried an increased element of risk anyway from a pregnancy perspective, notwithstanding the fact that it's a higher risk because of being multiples in terms of triplets. When the children were born aged 32 weeks, so whatever that is, 8 weeks premature, it became very apparent within hours of Essie being born that she'd suffered a grade 4 lung hemorrhage, which then obviously had a knock-on impact of a grade 4 ventricular hemorrhage in her brain. So effectively she was not expected to live 24 hours, and decided to stick two fingers up at every single medical professional that decided that she was a lost cause and wouldn't ever come off a ventilator and things like that. So the little girl came home aged 11 weeks old after a pretty lengthy stay in NICU, which is the neonatal intensive care unit at one of the London hospitals. She came home, as I've mentioned, sort of being tube fed, so she couldn't feed orally. She had very significant lung damage, so was on oxygen. She had quadruple cerebral palsy, so no movement in any of her limbs, and also ended up developing severe epilepsy. I mean, the list of things that she couldn't do was very, very long, but in some ways that's not what defined her. What defined her is everything that she taught us as a family, and just like those little things. And I always say to people, and this comes back to the point around sort of celebrating normal and seeing the world through kind eyes, for want of a better description. When you're starting from nothing, i.e. no expectations, like no communication, no mobility, etc., those little things are huge, huge successes. And that's what we celebrated with Essie. It was like the day where she could have limited head control for a couple of seconds before it would come crashing down on your shoulder when you were carrying her around. It was when she was reaching out for a toy for a split second, or she did a little bit of a smirk rather than a smile. She never quite managed a smile. It was more of a smirk. So that's something that I now know that I'm very privileged to have experienced as a parent, which is actually, I could tell you all of the little things that Essie could do. I honestly wouldn't be able to tell you any of those milestones that Roman and Eva accomplished, because quite frankly, it was normal. It was expected. It wasn't really to be celebrated. I know that Roman took his first steps when Essie was in a hospital in London having an operation to move her feeding tube to a button into her tummy. I remember that. I couldn't honestly tell you where Eva took her first steps, and that doesn't make me a rubbish mother. It just means that I was lucky to be able to take those things for granted.
That's incredible. I'm sort of at a loss for words, because I can't imagine what it must be like to go through something, like that. But as you say, it gives you an incredible perspective, and hopefully a lot of those messages and lessons are lessons and messages that you can pass on, and I'm sure have, onto Roman and Eva.
I think that's what I would also like to say is the reason why I'm so open in saying everything that we've been through is because I know how lonely a journey it is. You've sort of alluded to it already. I haven't just, in inverted commas, lost a daughter. I've lost a life. I've lost friendships. I've lost people who find our situation too distressing, too harrowing. And that's quite a difficult adjustment process in some ways as well, because you're trying to adjust to what life now looks like and will look like forevermore. Like every day we wake up and sort of one of our children isn't there. And I don't profess for 1 minute to be sort of going through the worst thing that any person on this earth is experiencing. But I know that I'm not alone in this journey, and there are many people who have either lost a child and lost hopes and dreams when it might have been an early miscarriage, or it could be the death of a child when they're a teenager or even older. Like, grief and loss is a very humbling experience in many ways, but it's a very unique experience. So I don't have a template for how to survive, because quite frankly, every day that I wake up, I'm trying to learn how to survive and how to bring up two children who ask more and more questions, and I want to be able to respond to them honestly and owe it to them to respond honestly. But every person who's experienced trauma, and this is a bit of an education for me in some ways, when you've gone through an event as significant as what we have, it's trauma, and it's how you cope with trauma and how you almost don't harm, if that's the right word, the development of the children who we see every day in Roman and Eva. We always say to them, Essie's still with us. She's in our hearts and in our heads. Like, we love her and we have memories. So I know that I'm lucky that I got 18 months of memories, and the fact that Roman and Eva are asking me so many questions every day is just part and parcel of the parenting after loss journey that I have to go through. But I want to educate them about their sister, because then they can pass it on to other people.
Yes. Well, shifting gears a little bit, focusing on the topic of education, you mentioned earlier that you made a transition from investment banking over to communications, and it's, two pretty different career paths. Reflecting on your experience, would you do anything different if you had to go back to high school and, give yourself a little bit of advice?
I wouldn't have dropped French at such an early age. I think my one regret from an education perspective is listening to others at quite a young age rather than listening to what I wanted to study. There weren't many people or any people in my family that had gone through sort of the higher education process prior to me. I think my grandfather studied in university in Canada, but that was probably about it before I went to university. So in some ways, I wish I wasn't so eager to listen to the advice of others, and I think I wish I'd just been quite determined with the decisions that I took from an education perspective. Anyway, I regret giving up a language. I think being able to speak a second language fluently is something that at some point I'd like to do. I think I might be waiting for retirement at this rate, but yeah, definitely will encourage Roman and Eva to keep learning and to keep developing language skills as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense. And I think the reason why I'm asking that question is when people go through such life tragedies, it's almost, it takes an event like that to make a change in life. It doesn't matter what that change may be, but many times people are doing something that they may not be happy with. And I think as a culture, we're so focused on careers and we're so focused on, building, maintaining and developing your career. And we forget to live. Like you said, life is for living. Education to a large degree informs what you do with your career. But if you had to, over the next couple of years now, as Roman and Eva are growing up, asking more and more questions, undergoing their education journey, what bits of advice would you give them as it relates to identifying a career path or developing their educational roadmap so that they can one day do what it is that they want to do?
I think education is a very unique experience, and as much as I don't want to influence what they do, I think I'm going to probably have to bite my tongue at some point and just make sure that they do what they want to do. But also as well, I think it's we have two things that we say to them already, and bearing in mind they're 4, nearly 5. One is never give up, which is a message that we think that they should continue from their sister Essie, and the other is there's no such thing as can't, implying you have to at least try. But other than that, I want them to achieve what they can achieve, but without me deciding that only means becoming a barrister or a brain surgeon or something like that. Success looks differently for different people, and I think I don't ever really want to influence what their ultimate end game is. But I guess I also want them to continue to learn as much as possible. And even though they've only just started school, and my sister tells me off for this, but I say to them, you've got a job. Your job is now to go to school and to learn and to enjoy learning and to ask questions and to be a sponge in many ways, because your brain will absorb all of this different information, and it's entirely up to you as an individual what you do to process it and how you compute it and what the output ultimately ends up being in terms of your career and, I don't know, your destiny. But at the end of the day, I think education is a facilitator. It facilitates opportunities. It doesn't mean that it'll only facilitate one opportunity. In many ways, I think now my career, having changed trajectory once, is probably going to be the anomaly. I would imagine that people will change careers multiple times now during their lifetime. But that's the beauty of education, and that's the beauty of learning, and that foundation just sets you up for whatever, hopefully, you want to become.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you look at the current state of the education system, specifically traditional education, primary, secondary and tertiary, followed by a sort of flow into the traditional working world. The digital economy has grown. Coronavirus in 2020 has been an absolute catalyst for growth in the online space. How do you think the education system is likely to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years?
We have a responsibility as parents and as educators in all shapes and forms to set the children up for the future as best as we can, whatever that future looks like. So when I was looking around schools for Roman and Eva, because they've literally just started reception in primary school in the UK, you're looking at schools in a different way than I remember my education. You're looking for schools that can teach your kids to code. You're looking for schools that can teach your kids to understand technology in its beauty and also in its limitations in some way. And you're also looking for schools to teach people those social skills that are going to be probably even more important as we transition to a virtual world in some ways rather than a physical world where we have to engage with people that we will probably never even meet. And there's so many different things. And I think about the way that people especially are experiencing university education now at the minute. And it just feels like a very different experience to what I had when I went to university. But that's not to say that it's the wrong experience. It's just a slightly different one. And I think I shouldn't feel old at 41, but in some ways I do feel old at 41 because I know that my kids are going to go through a very different education system and come out in a world that has technology, especially being used in a very different application to what I entered the sort of the post-education world in.
Yeah, I mean, the rate at which education and technology is evolving the education system is quite staggering. So coming back to what you mentioned earlier, you just briefly touched on sort of parental responsibilities, and you're obviously an incredibly engaged parent with your kids. Where do you think the line is drawn between a parent's responsibility and an educator, such as a teacher's responsibility? I think many times kids in the classroom, there's sort of a clear or actually an unclear line as to where the teacher's role and responsibility starts and stops, and where the parental roles and responsibilities start and stop. And that obviously changes family to family. But in your mind, where do you think that line is drawn, and how much of a role should parents play in the education of their children?
I think, and this is sort of my opinion, I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I think as a parent, you're responsible for your children's education. Like, if you don't have their development and their learning at the heart of everything that you're doing as a parent, then you're handing the fun bit over to someone else to do in many ways. I think as much as I love the constant questions that my 4-year-olds ask me, they also drive me slightly nuts with all of their questions. But it's an honor and it's a beauty to be able to see the eyes of the world once again through a child. And I think that's something that we're really privileged as parents and people who are involved in raising this next generation of children who are hopefully going to be a bit more kind, a bit more inclusive, a bit more empathetic, a bit freer from whatever boundaries that they might have encountered previously. I think education and learning sits at home first. And some people obviously homeschool and keep the learning at home, full stop. But in many ways, in our particular household, we've got 2 little brains that are just craving information and knowledge. And we're very lucky in a 2020 world to be able to have Google to answer those questions that I remember when I was asking questions of my parents, it would be look it up in the encyclopedia rather than let me just ask Google what is faster, an ostrich or a cheetah, or the other questions that my kids ask. I mean, we're in the house doing pacing to try and measure what is larger, a whale, different types of whales. I mean, the questions that they ask us are many and varied. And for me, I want them to have as much of a constant in terms of learning at home and then learning at school. Like, the teacher has a very difficult job, in my opinion, especially in the UK. I mean, Roman and Eva are in a class of 30, which has got one teacher and a learning assistant. And these are very, very excitable 4-year-olds that don't really know sometimes where the boundaries are for what they can and can't do. But it has to be an element of consistency. I'm not giving my kids to a teacher to be parented. I'm giving my kids to a teacher to have that desire to learn and to develop be reinforced and in some ways accelerated in a way that I would never be able to do it at home.
Yeah. It's a very interesting and thought-provoking response, because if I think back to, myself being a kid, there's a lot of things that I wish my parents had done, although, they, in my opinion, did a great job. But it was always interesting for me to see how the level to which parents were involved amongst my peers, and how some of those things, reflecting on it now, may have impacted the way in which some of my peers behaved. Or, for example, simply the sort of appetite for information. That fundamental philosophy of curiosity, which drives all those little questions, is something that, the younger of an age you can instill that, the better.
It's a privilege to be able to influence little people, and it does come with responsibility, and it does come with active involvement and active participation. Yes, there will be days of a weekend where I shove my kids in front of the TV. I mean, goodness knows, I'm not the only mother to do that, but more often than not, we'll be outside and we'll be learning and we'll be talking. And yeah, we try to keep them as stimulated as possible, because we don't know what their potential is, and in some ways they don't know what their potential is. So we'll be guided by them as much as they'll be guided by us.
Yes. So your kids are at an interesting age now. I suppose screen time is probably something that you're starting to become a little concerned with. How do you feel about that, and how do you regulate that as a parent?
Having just started school, they've now got that online education platform, and we're using phones, computers, tablets for just sort of little bits of research. Like, we don't put them in front of an iPad. They probably know how to use an iPad, because, my goodness, 4-year-olds and technology is just a scary thing. I mean, I think my son frequently locks me out of my iPhone for 5 minutes, and I'm like, how on earth have you been doing this? Or I'll find photos on my phone that Eva's been taking, which I have no comprehension that she ever had my phone. But we're trying to limit screen time, or at least keep screen time for education purposes, but recognising that obviously the latest stuff on Disney Plus is always going to be a bit of a draw for a 4-year-old.
Of course. And I think a lot of those games or apps that they may enjoy, in the end of the day, it further stimulates that curiosity, and the ability to pick up a device and communicate with that device and become proficient at using it as an extension of yourself, in order to achieve whatever that may be. In the end of the day, I don't really see that as a negative, specifically given the direction that the world's moving into.
Technology is definitely going to be part and parcel of learning in the future, full stop. I mean, it has to be. It's something that you can take on holiday. It's something that you can take when you go to the grandparents' house. It's something that you can take where you go anywhere in the world. It's that access to a classroom and a learning environment 24/7 if you need it, wherever you are in the world.
Oh, absolutely. So I think for any parents listening, it's obviously it's an incredibly moving story, and I think with your permission we'll put the link to your website in the show notes, so that anybody that's interested can go and have a little bit of a further read into your very unique story. That said, for parents that are listening that have gone through similar tragedies in their life, what sort of advice would you give these parents? Specifically as it relates to treating your other kids post such a traumatic event, And then how do you go about moving forward?
I would say be honest. Never refuse to answer or try and brush over a question if a child is asking it to you. That if they're asking it to you, they're asking because they want to know the answer. Make sure that you bring the child that is no longer physically present into your daily lives as much as possible. So Essie has her own bedroom in our house still, and we never buried her ashes, so she's in a little pot, because I don't like the word urn. So she's in a little pot in her room, and the kids say good morning to her, they say good night to her, they speak her name freely. I think pretty much every single kid in the class knows about Essie, and they ask questions in a way that feels right when they see someone in a wheelchair, or they see someone who has got a hearing aid in, or something like that. It's not being afraid to ask questions and to learn, and to respect that whilst sometimes things are hard for us to answer as parents, especially parents who've lost a child, we have to answer questions that are being asked as honestly as possible, and to tell the truth.
And how do you teach a child to, by default, tell the truth and to maintain this philosophy of kindness in their life?
I don't know, to be completely honest. I think half of parenting is gut, right? You're going with your gut, with what feels right. We're being open and honest when we're talking about things. We have photo albums of Essie and pictures of Essie around the house. Sometimes when the kids go to bed, they get 2 books read to them every night, or they can have a book and an Essie story. So we'll tell a little story about Essie, which is effectively a memory. Or we're out and about somewhere and we'll be like, oh, we used to like coming here with Essie because she used to like the sea air, for example, or something like that. There's a way of making her part and parcel of our daily lives that isn't scary, because in some ways, and this was one thing that I wanted to talk about as well, when you're trying to find that school or that education facility that is going to get your children when they've effectively been experiencing trauma, like you have to know that they're going to be able to ask the questions of their teachers in a way that they ask the questions of us. So we were very, very lucky when we found the school that Roman and Eva go to, because the headmistress there spent probably 35 minutes on the phone to me, and I could hear her like writing notes when I was telling her all about Essie. And I remember her saying to me, I'm doing this because I only want you to say this once, because I know how hard it is for you to say all of these different things, which I appreciate. But in many ways, it's not hard to say once, because I have to say little bits of what happens to us and has happened to us every single day in different ways. So understanding that an education environment is willing to understand that our situation is a non-typical situation, and to want to learn from us as much as we want to learn from them about what the right thing is to do, and to navigate this very strange path together, that's really important.
Yes. So what do the next couple of years look like for you? Obviously, it's been an incredibly challenging period, and you've come through this, and, you know, if anything, acting as an incredible source of inspiration for many people around you. What do the next couple of years in your life look like?
I'd like to say calmer, but I think it's probably just going to get a bit crazier. It's very strange, actually. And I think one thing that 2020 certainly taught me, and my husband as well, is that we respond best when we're around others, like physically. So I think I would like to spend the next couple of years almost reminding Roman and Eva and having experiences as a family that for whatever reason we've just not been able to have this year, whether that's going traveling and hearing new languages, or just all learning from each other. Yes, from a selfish perspective, I'd like to be a success professionally, and that would be great, and to go on and achieve whatever I can achieve personally. But fundamentally, I would just like me and my family to be happy and to do things together and to live, for want of a better word.
Yeah, life is for living. So to end off, we like to ask all of our guests the same question, and you can take a moment if you want to think about it. And that question is, what do you believe about the education system or education in general that most people may disagree with?
I get the whole vocational side of the education system and the need to have continued learning, but I do fundamentally think that it is motivational to have exams and qualifications ranked and to have different grades and things like that. I mean, I don't fully agree with the label that sometimes gets attributed to people if they're not an A grade student or whatever it is. But I think to be the best that you can be, there is an element of recognition that comes with the grading system that I actually do support. And I would always prefer to have degrees and others that are exam-based and not coursework-based.
Yes, great. And last question I'd love to know, or actually not a question, maybe just to give you a platform. You know, it really is inspiring speaking to you and just hearing what it is that you've been through and the insights that you've gained from this experience. What message would you like to leave anybody with that's listening to this? Because, you know, it goes without saying that your experience is a unique one. But the insights extend to pretty much anybody. So what message would you like to leave people with?
To never give up, and that adversity in whatever shape or size or form it comes in shouldn't be a limitation for anyone. I hate the word strong. I really don't like it when people describe me and my husband as strong. But in many ways, I'll contradict myself. You don't know what you're capable of and what inner strength and inner resolve you've got until you've been challenged. And don't fear challenge, because it will leave you in many ways in a changed person. But that doesn't mean you're going to be a bad person or a person that isn't quite what you were before. You'll just be changed. And I think as well, one thing that we always say about Essie is if you've got love and life and happiness in your life, you really can accomplish many, many things. And I think don't take what you've got for granted, because what you've got is probably something that someone else can only aspire to have. So please don't compare yourself to anyone else. Please don't do that whole competitive parenting thing and look over your shoulder at what someone else is doing. Like, nobody knows what happens behind closed doors. Nobody knows what people don't always see, and every experience is unique, but that does not make anyone's experience worse or not as whole as another person's. I think, like I said to start with, kindness and inclusivity and love and laughter go a very long way in life.
And laughter. I love that one. Thank you so much for your time, Lorna. It's really been a pleasure listening to you and, you know, just talking to you about a pretty interesting and unique journey. And yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you. It's one of those unique conversations where you listen to somebody's story and you sort of at a loss for words, because there's it evokes quite a bit of emotion. But thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.
The Future Minds podcast is brought to you by Smartec. Smartec is an award-winning, intelligent, online mathematics and coding program for kids aged 4 to 14. Powered by sophisticated, adaptive AI, Smartec teaches kids math and coding from the comfort of home in as little as 15 minutes per day. For more information, visit smartec.com or download the app on tablet or iPad today.